Chapter 4. Into the mine. Stanley and Arthur waited impatiently while Calamity Jasper led Gold Rush to a shady spot by a stream so he could drink and munch grass. Then they followed her to the mine entrance. Calamity handed each boy a flashlight. Then she switched on her headlamp and led them in. The mine was dark and dank. When their eyes adjusted, the boys could make out several men, blackened with dirt, chipping away at the walls and whispering to one another. "Don't pay them any mind," Calamity whispered. "Them prospectors are a jealous bunch. Every man to himself, that kind of thing. They'll hog-tie you and throw you off the mountain if they think you're trespassing on their claim." She nodded into the darkness. "Reckon we better mosey on a little further." Boys followed Calamity deeper and deeper into the dark mine shaft. The tink, tink, tink of the prospectors' hammers grew fainter, and the light grew dimmer. "I don't see any gold yet," Arthur called out to Calamity Jasper, who was far ahead now. "Right, where's the gold?" Stanley called out even louder. The boys were comforted by their voices in the dark, dank mine. "Where's the gold?" they cried together. "Don't yell," came Calamity's voice. "You'll cause a..." Suddenly, there was a tremendous rumbling roar. Rocks and rubble came crashing down in front of Stanley and Arthur. A cave-in. So that's why everyone was whispering. At the mine's entrance, the prospectors dropped their hammers and ran out. "Every man for himself," they cried. "Head for the hills." Stanley was tempted to call after them, but they were already in the hills. But he was much too worried to be bothered. "Where is Calamity Jasper?" he asked Arthur. The boys played their flashlights over the walls and dirt in front of them. "Do you think?" Arthur whispered. "Shh," Stanley whispered back. In the quiet, the boys could make out a muffled voice. "Gall darn fools." "Don't worry," Stanley called in quietly to the trapped cowgirl. "We'll get you out." "Step aside," Arthur told his brother. "It's your fault she's in there." Then he called to Calamity, quietly also. "I'll get you out. I'm very strong for my age." Arthur was strong, that was true, but it was also true that he felt a lot stronger when he was wearing his Mighty Man t-shirt. But today he was wearing his authentic cowboy clothes instead. He pushed against a big rock. He pushed and pushed. The rock didn't budge. "Step aside," Stanley said. "It's your fault she's in there. I'll get her out with my flatness." Stanley surveyed the rubble in front of him. There was a gap between two big rocks about an inch wide. It might work. He squeezed and folded himself until, yes, Stanley Lambchop worked himself through until he came out into a small, clear space. And there was Calamity sitting on a rock. "I'm here," he said proudly. "You can start worrying now." Calamity looked up at him. "And why is that?" "Because I'm used to being a hero. It's what I do. Now that I'm flat, I rescued my mother's favorite ring. I helped capture sneak thieves in the famous museum. So I'll get you out," he assured her. Calamity Jasper stood up and turned her head so her headlamp illuminated the small space. "Really?" she asked. "How?" Stanley looked around. He saw the problem. He could get through the gap in the rocks, but she couldn't. "I'm sorry," he said, embarrassed. "I'll come up with something." "Just go get help," Calamity muttered. Then she sat back down on the rocks and turned her back to him. Stanley worked himself back through to the other side. "My flatness didn't help," he admitted to Arthur. "Well, my strength didn't help either," Arthur said. "Too bad we can't combine the two." "Hey!" He jumped up. "We've been studying machines at school. Do you remember how a lever works?" Stanley understood Arthur's clever idea at once. The boys rolled a small rock beside the larger one, and Stanley lay himself over it. He worked his feet under the large rock and made himself stiff as a board. "Use your strength to press down on my shoulders," he directed his brother. Arthur did. With a deep creak, the boulder rolled aside. Calamity Jasper crawled through the gap. She narrowed her eyes and scowled at the two boys as she stormed past them to the mine entrance. The boys followed, and after the three children rubbed their eyes in the bright afternoon sunshine, they stared in disbelief. Gold Rush was gone. Chapter 5. on the trail. Must have been spooked by the cave-in, Calamity moaned. I'll have to track him before he gets too far. The boys kept a safe distance behind. Calamity didn't seem in any mood for their company. Now and then they heard her muttering, "Oh, darn show-offs," and they dropped back even further. Stanley and Arthur felt miserable. They had been show-offs, and they knew it now. After a while, Calamity gave a little whoop and ran into a clearing. There stood Gold Rush, snorting and lathered in sweat. The cowgirl threw her arms around her horse. "Let's get you some water, fella." Calamity looked around. "We're a ways off from the stream," she worried out loud, "and I don't see any signs of a spring." "I can help. I have an idea," Stanley cried. Calamity shot him a look that said she'd heard just about enough from him, but Stanley did indeed have an idea. He lay down in the grass in front of Gold Rush and curved himself into the shape of a trough. "Pour in some water from the canteens," he directed Calamity. Calamity did, and then Stanley held very still as the horse's big lips came right down and slurped from his belly. It tickled, but Stanley Lambchop did not move, and he did not spill one drop. When Gold Rush had finished drinking, Calamity helped Stanley to his feet. She wore a big grin as she shook his hand. "Maybe I was wrong about you, partner. Any friend of my horse is a friend of mine." "So you're not angry with us anymore?" asked Arthur. "Ah, no, I reckon you two aren't half bad for a couple of greenhorns. Now, I better fix us some grub. We're lost, partners. We're going to have to figure out how we get home from here. A cowboy can't think on an empty stomach." Calamity Jasper pulled a can of beans and a pot from her saddlebags. She built a fire, and soon the beans were bubbling cheerfully in the pot. "Cowboys always carry beans for emergencies," she confided. Arthur made a mental note to carry beans with him from now on. "How did you learn to be a cowboy?" he asked Calamity. "How did you learn to follow tracks like that? We didn't see anything, but you followed right to Gold Rush." "Following tracks isn't a cowboy skill. I'm part Lakota Sioux Indian," Calamity said proudly. "We Native Americans know a lot of useful things, like which plants make medicine and how to hunt and fish, and how to use, whoa, doggy, smoke signals." Calamity jumped to her feet. She ordered Arthur to carry a load of tumbleweeds. When he returned, she piled the tumbleweeds onto the campfire. Immediately, a dark, thick smoke streamed upward. "What about a blanket?" Stanley asked. "Don't you need a blanket for smoke signals?" Calamity grinned. "That's where you come in, partner." Both boys understood at once. Arthur picked up Stanley's feet, and Calamity took hold of his arms, and together they flapped Stanley over the fire, sending puffs of thick smoke into the clear air. Stanley very bravely held his breath and didn't cough once. Before too long, they heard a rustling in the bushes at the edge of the clearing. The tour group. "We saw your signals," Calamity's father said. "Came to see what you youngsters were up to." "Looks like we're up to a real Wild West time," said George Lambchop. "What a trip, huh, boys?" Chapter 6. Around the Campfire. The children were grateful to follow the tour group back along the trail. As they crested Mount Rushmore over Lincoln's Face, the boys walked over to the edge to take a look. The repair crew had done an excellent job, and the crack was barely visible. Stanley stepped out even further. "See, Arthur," he boasted, "I can stand out there too." But just then a sudden gust of wind caught Stanley by surprise. It swept him off his feet, and he went skittering down Lincoln's steep forehead, coming to rest on the bridge of Lincoln's long nose. Stanley held on for dear life. He looked around, far, far above him. He saw Arthur looking terribly worried, and suddenly he was very glad that his brother had brought his authentic cowboy gear with him. "Arthur," he cried, "throw down your lasso." Arthur uncoiled his lasso and swung it around, aiming, and then let go, and the rope went sailing into the South Dakota sky and landed right in front of Stanley's outstretched hand. Calamity Jasper gave Arthur an admiring nod. "Mighty fine twirling, buckaroo," she applauded. "Mighty fine." Stanley grabbed a hold of the rope and tied it around his waist. "Bring me up, Arthur," he called. Just then, another gust of wind blew across the mountain. It lifted Stanley Lambchop up like a kite, and up until the lasso was stretched taut, Stanley flew high above the tour group. "Boys," Mrs. Lambchop called when she saw what was going on, "quit that horsing around." "Now, dear, the boys are just having a bit of fun," Mr. Lambchop said. "It's their vacation, too, after all. I don't see the harm." "I suppose you're right, George," said Mrs. Lambchop. "Still, I noticed Stanley smelled strongly of smoke, and that's not good for a growing boy. I'd like him to come back to camp and change his clothes. Arthur, reel your brother in now, please." When Stanley was back on Earth, Mr. Lambchop invited Calamity to join them for a cookout. After a delicious meal of hot dogs and hamburgers, Mrs. Lambchop said, "I believe this celebration calls for s'mores," to cheers all around. While they were toasting the marshmallows, Stanley and Arthur apologized for causing so much trouble in the mine earlier. "Also, we're sorry you didn't find any gold," Arthur said. "You have nothing to show for all that time in the mine." "Well, that ain't exactly so, partner," Calamity said with a grin. She dug in her pocket and produced a large, gleaming gold nugget. "I found it in my boot. Reckon it fell in during the cave-in." "Real gold?" breathed Arthur. "Can I hold it?" "You can do more than hold it, partner," Calamity said with a mysterious smile. "You got a hammer?" Arthur fetched the hammer they had packed to pound in the tent stakes. Calamity placed the nugget on a flat rock and brought the hammer down hard, cracking it into 3 chunks of gold. She gave one to Stanley and one to Arthur. "They're yours. You earned it," she said to the brothers. "Way I see it, without the cave-in, I wouldn't have gold in the first place. And without you, there wouldn't have been no cave-in." And with that, Calamity Jasper mounted her trusty steed, waved goodbye, and rode off into the sunset.